Hi, Mr. Standing. Oh, how to begin? Should I just ask a question, or what should I?
Yeah, go ahead. Nice to talk to you. I wish I were in Sweden physically. I've been to Sweden many times. It's a country I love. I have many Swedish friends, so it's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure for me to talk to you. I've actually really, you were one of the people that inspired me to go to such lengths to try to introduce the idea of basic income in an objective and good way to as many people as possible. Really, I have many questions, but I thought we could just talk and see where it goes. The first thing I could ask you is about the idea of labor in Sweden and unions. It seems like all the politicians and the people in the country as well think that labor is the solution for all of our problems. When there isn't enough stable jobs, the politicians become desperate to try to, then they try to put everyone into work by making the conditions less than ideal and taking away the security that people have through the welfare system. So they are forced into labor, and they think that this will make things better, that people will be able to get jobs. It's a really horrifying example. I really just want to ask you, in this country such as Sweden, where labor is so strongly embedded in our identity, how do one speak to people that are skeptic of the idea of basic income? How do one introduce this idea to the unions? Could you share your thoughts, please?
Yeah, I have been coming to Sweden since the early 1980s. And I had the great privilege of becoming friends with Rudolf Meitner and Gösta Rehn, who were the architects of the Swedish model. Both came from the LO, from the labor background. After the Second World War, they established the principles of what's called the Swedish model. And Rudolf in particular became a good friend, and he understood that the labor model of the post-Second World War period had been progressive, but by the 1980s, it had reached the end of its progressive development. And towards the end of his life, he became, actually, we often discussed it, he understood and thought that basic income would be the next progressive idea in Scandinavia in general. And I think it's important to understand that the labor line that was part of the LO traditions and part of the Social Democrats and the whole of that era is fundamentally a progressive idea for the early part of the 20th century, but it became a restrictive one. And if you think about it, labor is performing for bosses. It is not all types of work. Many types of work are not included in the Swedish LO definition or objectives. And maximizing everybody in positions of subordination, which is what being in a job is all about, is not really an emancipatory dream for the long term. It was progressive compared with what happened before 1938 in particular, but in terms of where we are today, it became sexist, it became hierarchical. All work that is not labor was disregarded, not provided with social protection, except in a residual sort of way. And the privileges of society were supposed to go to those who were performing labor. So the work that women do, more of their time than anything else, and hopefully more men are doing these days, care work, voluntary work, community work, none of it gets considered as legitimate sources for citizenship and citizenship rights. So for me, that's always been a dead end, laborism. If it was the work line, genuinely work line, you would be wanting people to have freedom to decide on the type of work that they would like to do. I mean, that is, for me, an emancipatory goal that progressive people should have. And I think the trade unions, particularly the LO, got trapped in backing a model that had ceased to be a progressive dream by the late 1980s, when I wrote a book on labor market flexibility in Sweden. And I think that one has to see what's happened in Sweden since the 1980s in that context. Inequality has been increasing in Sweden faster than practically any other OECD country. I see that 5 new billionaires have been created during the pandemic. And it's a society which no longer has preserved the whole idea of
solidarity,
limited inequality in the labor market. So for me, it's a model that doesn't exist anymore. It is now a workfare state, and it's time that the progressives in Sweden woke up and took a more ecologically progressive stance and say, our objectives should be to give everybody, every citizen, every legal resident of Sweden, basic economic security. And at the moment, that is not taking place.
That is a great actually acclamation of what has just happened in Sweden since the 80s. Really, in the basic income network in Sweden, it's not that large yet, but I'm seeing that it's growing with the especially during the pandemic, and there is a certain group that actually favors the negative income tax system, which can be integrated into the Swedish system relatively simply, easily. But I have read in your book, The Precariat, and in some other, you are a bit critical to this idea. And I really don't understand why. Why don't you think that it's a good way to introduce basic income?
Well, first of all, a negative income tax, as originally conceived by Milton Friedman and a number of other economists in the United States, is based on the family as a unit. It's based on tax-paying labor, and it's paid in practice after the event of earning. I think it's a distraction from what basic income should be all about. Basic income is fundamentally an ethical question. And giving everybody in Sweden who's a legal resident, citizen, or whatever in Sweden, a basic income is fundamentally about common justice. It's not about trying to deal with poverty. That is instrumental reasons, and it's understandable reasons. But the reasoning for basic income to give everybody is a common dividend, because the wealth of every Swede is far more to do with the efforts and achievements of the many generations who've gone before today.
The commons.
It's the commons. And basically, my argument has always been that if you allow for the private inheritance of private riches, which is giving a minority a lot of something for nothing, they've done nothing to deserve that. You've even abolished inheritance tax in Sweden. You're basically saying that it's okay for a minority to be given basic income in a big, big way, but not for the general population. I think that's unjust. And I think it's justice to say, look, the wealth has been created by our ancestors going back, but I don't know whose ancestors more or less have contributed. And the only fair way is to give everybody a common dividend on the public wealth as a base, as an anchor, to say, if you are a Swede, if you are living legally in Sweden, you have the right to have basic security. That's your right. I don't want it fuddling around with the income tax system, the negative income tax, or the social assistance. These are matters of the welfare state, but basic income is more than that. It is a social mechanism of an expression of social solidarity. Swedes have always primed themselves with believing in the folk, believing in the home, believing that the community exists as a community. Well, the best way to express that is for everybody to have a common dividend.
Economic security.
Economic security. And that, I think, is fundamentally the reason. I also believe it enhances freedom, and it gives people a sense of belonging. These are the reasons for supporting a basic income.
I'm thinking about, for example, in England. You have worked a lot in England about this question. How much has it progressed? Where do you think it has reached in comparison to other places such as Canada, New York, or Sweden, for that matter?
So I think since I wrote my books on basic income, the one that I wrote that was published just at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and it's called Battling 8 Giants, Basic Income Now. And the theme of the book is that at the end of the Second World War, William Beveridge was invited by the government to prepare a report on reforming social security in Britain. In 1942, he produced his report. And on page 2 of that report, he said, this is a time for revolutions, not for patching, not for putting plaster on wounds. And he said the challenge is to defeat 5 giants. The giants were disease, ignorance, idleness, squalor, bad sanitation and things, and want, poverty. And really how the world economy has developed in the last 30 years, I said, look, we have now a very fragile economic system in the world, which I characterize as rentier capitalism, not free market capitalism, in which there are 8 giants that have to be defeated. Those 8 giants are inequality, insecurity, debt, stress, precarity, robots, the threat of automation, the threat of extinction, and neo-fascist populism, right? And when I was asked by Massive Attack to do a video on the theme of the book and on basic income, the COVID crisis had arrived. This was last July. And I made the video with them. And I said, basically, the COVID pandemic is the ninth giant, because it's come at a time when the international economy is so fragile because we've got a breakdown of the old social democratic models, that you only have to have a small crisis, and pandemic was a big crisis, and everything comes into major crisis, which is what we've got today. And I've been impressed by the fact that over the past year, during the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a surge of interest and support for basic income all over the world. Every single day, I hear from some country a new initiative or be invited to give a talk or something all over the world. I must have done well over 100 talks on basic income. And we've got a situation where in the United States today, 45 cities are experimenting with some sort of basic income experiment. And in Britain, only 2 weeks ago, the government of Wales has announced that it intends to do a pilot of a basic income. And I've been asked to be advisor, and 32 councils so far across Britain have voted in favor of doing basic income pilots in their area. And in Scotland, the government there is wanting to do experiments as well. Same in Northern Ireland, also in Ireland as well. So we've got a whole set of initiatives and developments that I think are very positive. We see places like South Korea, the Republic of Korea, where they've got huge experiments taking place, also in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in Canada, you mentioned, and in the United States. So we've got a worldwide opportunity.
This is actually really brilliant, because I also have seen these initiatives all over the world, but it really doesn't. You don't hear about it by politicians or any sort in Scandinavia overall. Finland did make this experiment, but it wasn't meant for everybody. It was more like the social security, that they would remove the restrictions of you seeking jobs to get this benefit. So it's really, it's a good step, absolutely, but I don't really consider it as a basic income in the way that you describe it. And in Sweden, there is a place in Sweden, Linköping, I think. They have actually also implemented some kind of this kind of thinking, but it's not really, as I said before, a basic income for everybody. There is the movement here in Sweden right now is very much around the negative income tax, but it's meant that what they are meaning is that existence minimum around 12,000 Swedish crowns should be everybody should get this if they earn below 12,000 crowns. If you earn more, then you have a job that you want to have, and so forth and so on, and you don't need this security. And really, it seems to be stuck there. I can't seem to get through to people talking about a bigger way of seeing these things, because they always go to, how can we afford it? How? It's not possible. And then I came to think about your idea of, well, your book, The Commons, really, and some YouTube videos that you made. Could you please tell us a little bit more about The Commons and how this can be a way to make basic income a reality in a country wealthy such as Sweden?
Yeah, let me take that discussion that you've just given us in two directions. The first I want to say is that whether you have a negative income tax or whether you have means-tested social assistance, as you have in Sweden, as we have in Britain and in many other countries, what you're doing is you're saying only the poor should have benefits. We will target the poor. And there's a very famous saying by one of the founders of the welfare state theorizing in the post-Second World War era, Richard Titmuss. He said that benefits that are only for the poor are invariably poor benefits. And what he means by that, what he meant by that, is that they tend to be given to people who are regarded as an act of charity, pity, as separate from us. And that disrupts the sense of solidarity. A universalistic scheme where everybody has rights, which is part of the ethos of the Swedish model at the beginning, is one that strengthens social solidarity. And if you have means-tested benefits, two things happen automatically, and they have happened in Sweden as they have in Britain and elsewhere. And you can't get away from this. First, you create poverty traps. What that means is if you're only giving to the poor, if they make any efforts to become non-poor, they lose benefits. And in effect, they pay a marginal tax rate over 80%. In other words, they lose on one hand and they gain a little extra by taking a low wage job, and they only get an extra 20%. Income is taxed at 80%. In Denmark, I saw that the calculations were that it's 86%, that marginal tax rate. It's a huge disincentive for people to take low wage jobs or make an improvement in their lives. Why? Then they're going to lose all that money that they try and get extra. In Finland, the organizers of the social security system told me, well, in some cases, it's over 100%. In other words, they get less by taking a job. Now, that is a crazy situation. It's a crazy situation. And it's made even worse by the fact that more and more people in all our countries are in the precariat. And the precariat is growing, whereby people are in and out of casual jobs, their incomes are fluctuating. It's very difficult to calculate what their incomes over a long period are because they're fluctuating and uncertain. And people have to wait for benefits if they qualify, and often it actually pays them not to take a job because it could be short term and they could be back in the queue to try and get benefits again, and they lose out altogether. So you've created a quagmire of insecurity and loss of income through this means-tested benefit. So what have governments done? Governments have said, okay, because there's no incentive for people to take those low-paid jobs when they're on benefits, they do coercion. They do punitive workfare type policies. And I saw that in Sweden. I've seen it in Britain. I've seen it elsewhere, where you basically turn your bureaucracy from people who are providing benefits to people who are policing people who are in need of benefits. It creates a horrible atmosphere at the bottom of the labor market. Is this what the Social Democrats are up to these days? Well, it is. And they've lost credibility because they no longer appear to be on the side of low-income people. They see them separately. Now, to get to the second part of your question, the commons, I've written a book called The Plunder of the Commons. The commons are what we inherit as part of public wealth. We go back throughout our history to the time, our ancient times, when the land was common, water was common, the air was common, the social amenities were common. They weren't part of private property. They were part of our commons. And it used to be that it was determined by a typical rule was that if it had been accepted as a commons for more than 20 years, then it was legitimately a commons. So we have natural commons, like the oil in the North Sea is part of the Norwegian commons. It should have been part of the British commons. The minerals or the timber, the forests of Sweden should be part of the commons. And you can go through all the attributes of the commons. There are the natural commons, there are the civil commons, the social commons. For example, the National Health Service in Britain became a social commons in 1968 when it had been a commons for 20 years. And it became part of the social commons of Britain. The same with social housing. And you've got cultural commons, and you've got education commons, educational institutions, and so on. Now, the commons have been taken away illegitimately by elites or sold off with privatization schemes, and they have been taken from the commoners, it's you and me among them, everybody, without compensation. I believe that we must build up commons capital funds along the model of the Norwegian pension fund, because it's a good source. You take the royalties from the oil and you build up the commons, but it doesn't have to be from just oil. You can do it on many other aspects. And we recycle the income that goes into that fund. You invest it in ecologically sustainable sectors and interests. And as you build up the fund, you can pay out a dividend in the form of a basic income. You can do it very quickly in terms of you start with land value tax, you start with wealth tax, you start with carbon tax, eco taxes. We need eco taxes. Sweden has done calculations, other countries have done calculations, how much revenue you can raise. But we only make eco taxes politically acceptable if we recycle to everybody equally, because otherwise those taxes are regressive. They tend to increase inequality, because if you have a carbon tax, that's a higher percentage of a poor person's income than it is of a higher income person. And you need to think of it as well as a way of compensating for the global warming and pollution that we're experiencing, because at the moment, the wealthy are the people who are causing global warming and pollution to a greater extent than the poor, and yet the poor are adversely affected to a much greater extent, whether they live in urban neighborhoods or near air.
Difficulty to get a property owned. It's the
for me, the mechanism for thing, and that goes back to the original idea of Rudolf Meidner's wage earner funds, incidentally, which came through the LO, had great difficulties in the 1970s, and by the time it emerged in public debate, it had been turned into basically a fifth pension fund in Sweden, and it lost its radical transformative character. But for me, building up a capital fund is both an ecological imperative and a way of paying for a basic income system. Now, you can build it up and distribute it as you build it the amount that you can pay out will go up and up. Norwegian fund today means that, in effect, every Norwegian is a millionaire, a dollar millionaire or a euro millionaire, if they calculated it in those terms. But because you built up a commons fund. It's not called a commons fund, but I think if you do it as a commons fund, and I've gone through the various ways of constructing that fund in my book, The Plunder of the Commons, the final chapter. For me, this is the best way of paying for a basic income system going forward.
Yeah.
Seeing it as a public property right, a common property right. And if you see it in those terms, you get away from the deserving poor, the undeserving poor, the this, that, the lazy and the person, and you get to say, well, this is a matter of justice. Now that, to me, is where the progressives in Sweden should be taking the debate. The same in Britain. I'm talking to the Labour Party, who've lost the ability to forge a progressive agenda. Because some of them, John McDonnell, I was an advisor to John for 3 years. He was the shadow chancellor. He understood this. But it was very difficult to articulate it. The Greens understand it. And I've spoken at the Green Party conferences several times in Britain. And for me, this is the way we should be taking the debate within BIEN, within the basic income networks, and seeing it not as a matter of social assistance. Is it better or worse than welfare payments and unemployment benefits, blah, blah, blah? It is better than those. But for me, the more fundamental reason is, as I say, common justice.
But there is one more thing that is actually about this idea of labor, of work, because somehow people tend to think that if you get a basic income, you will stop working, you will not be getting engaged into the labor market. And this is an odd way of seeing it, as there is a sociologist called Ronald Paulsen here in Sweden, and he written a book called Empty Labor, which talks about everybody that has a job, certain time of their work day, they are not productive. They don't do any work. They just sit and until they can get home, they don't do anything. And the thought of that really saddens me, because I think that people could be much more creative, and if they had more time for their homes and to be able to create new ideas.
Let me respond to that. First of all, if you ask people, if you received a modest basic income, which would just about cover your food and your rent, would you reduce or stop working?
No, because
99%. 99% of people say, no, of course not. If you ask them, well, will other people stop working? They say, oh yeah, they would.
Yeah.
That's a first contradiction. Second thing to realize is that there are many forms of work that actually take place, and we need to encourage them, and they're not remunerated like care work, as we've seen in the pandemic. And third, rather importantly, every pilot of basic income, and I've summarized them in my books, in this book, for example, basically how we can make it happen. I've got a whole chapter. But every pilot, every experiment has shown that basic income increases work, not decreases work. It's a prejudice to say that if people had basic income, they would stop working.
And yeah, that is...
The reasons vary. Reasons are you don't have the poverty trap problem we discussed earlier. Second, people have more confidence, more energy, more risk-taking capacities. And also they find that they can they can spend more time on forms of work that don't pay very well or don't pay at all, but in social terms are actually among the most valuable forms of activity in our society. Why on earth do people think that creating a job, of pouring tea for the boss in an office or factory, or sweeping floors, or cleaning toilets is somehow superior to enabling you or me or anybody listening to spend more time looking after their elderly mother or sick children or people in the community? It's ridiculous. And basically, I believe that if you have basic security, you want to be energized. The human condition is we want to be creative, we want to work, we want to improve the lives of our children, our community. We want to do things that we can't do because we have to take these boring jobs. Why do we want to put jobs on a pedestal? I would love it if we could automate most of the jobs that are being done today. My late friend David Graeber called them bullshit jobs.
Yeah.
Precariat, many of those jobs are a complete waste of time. They don't add to society. They don't add to my personal fulfillment. Why do we have to treat things that are instrumental as somehow wonderful? This is madness.
It's crazy.
It's a form of madness. Now, I don't dispute that in the way we have society, that jobs are necessary. Of course they are. But if you have basic income, then the people providing lousy jobs have two options. They can either raise the wages so that it becomes an attractive option for you to take those jobs, or they automate them, or they don't do them because it's not worth doing. So the essence of a basic income would be we would encourage certain types of automation. I think it would be to automate many of those things that are called jobs. Great. Or we can drive up the wages so that more of us would say, okay, I'll put up with those lousy conditions and unattractive features of working in an Amazon warehouse or cleaning toilets for a garage on the auto route or whatever, and I'll take that because I need that extra money. Now that creates a new dynamism. Now I cannot understand why people who claim they're on the left and are members of trade unions pushing for workers' rights are so afraid of giving people basic security. People who have basic security have more courage. They join unions, they join associations, they take action. They feel more confident. They feel they want to fight for the important things in life. So for me, the mentality of the old trade unions has got to change. Otherwise, they're history.
Yeah. They are, but I think the problem is more fundamental because what trade unions, if I understand them correctly, they are really representative of their members. And if their members aren't pushing for these kind of developments, then the trade unions can't really talk that much about them. They can't go out on strikes if you're in a precariat job because the people that are behind the unions don't really dare to go against their employer because they will lose their job and then they wouldn't have security. So I think if this discussion gets more lively in Sweden and people understand it, it will empower the unions to be able to take such action.
I think one thing to say there, Najan, is that the unions everywhere have been losing members, they've been losing legitimacy, they have been losing their vision, and they're on the defensive.
Yeah, they are.
They've got to transform themselves. They've got to transform themselves. They've got to be more emancipatory. They've got to be more concerned about ecological, environmental issues, about the precariat. Don't turn the precariat into the proletariat. It won't happen. They've got to transform themselves. As long as they take this sort of laborist line, only if you're doing jobs should you be treated well, then they're going to be history. And that is why, you know, the Social Democrats in Sweden used to be well over 50% of the electorate, well over 50% for years, because they were then on the side of a progressive.
Yeah.
Today they're not.
No.
Today, if they get 30%, they are pleased with themselves. Soon it will be like in other countries, they'll be down to 20%, 15%, or like in the Netherlands recently, wiped out altogether. That, I think, is the fate of the old Social Democrats, because they are not waking up to the need for a new progressive.
And it's really difficult for the leaders to become progressive, because until you become someone with power and influence enough to...
No. You can fight for things. No. Because basically we should all be revolting against what's happening. Revolting against the fact that Sweden is one of the countries with the fastest growing rates of inequality. This is something that would be so shaming for every progressive person in Sweden that they shouldn't be going back to old models. They should be forging a new agenda.
We used to be the country that people look up to when it comes to these kind of questions.
Exactly. But I mean, that period, and I still meet people who are thinking that Sweden is today what Sweden was in the 1980s. They still think that Swedish model is still there. But reality has changed.
The thing is that many young people, and really not only young people, but the precariat in overall, they are in favor of a lot of these things that we are talking about. Because when I began to go into these kind of topics and try to find more information, it was really difficult to pinpoint with words what was wrong until I found the information about it. But I think that people don't really, it feels like nobody has really enough time to do these researches. So that's why I'm trying to do this, so people can maybe get into it. I have one more question. So you talk about in the precariat about a particular group called the decitizens, or the
denizens.
Yes,
Denizens.
Or the people that have migrated from war or some other horrible condition, and they come here. They maybe have education or so on and so forth. Good people, but are finding it extremely difficult to find a job or become a part of the country, and they are now in many countries in Europe are blamed as the scapegoats for everything that's going wrong. We've heard this tune before, as you have talked about various times, but can you share your thoughts about how we can solve this problem from our kind of view, with a humanitarian kind of view, with the help of basic income? Could we make the lives of these people better? Could we make the society better? How would you?
Well, I think I'm glad that this is your final question, because it's important. My book on the precariat has been translated into 25 languages, including Swedish. And when I first wrote it, the first edition, it's about to come out, the 5th edition, next month. But I said in 2011, that if the progressive side of politics didn't understand what the precariat is all about, we would see the emergence of a political monster, which I characterized as a politics of inferno, neo-fascist populism. And sure enough, in 2016, Donald Trump became that monster. And I think what you have to understand is that the precariat today and then has three groups. The first group are the old working class individuals, families, offspring of old proletarian workers who don't have much education, but they feel they've lost what they had in the past. This group wants the past back. That's why they support populists like Trump, like Salvini.
Jimmy Åkesson in Sweden.
Yeah, exactly. And that across the whole of Europe, that group is voting against migrants, against foreigners, against minorities, often against women. The second group I call the real denizens, who are the migrants and are the minorities. And there are a huge number that have come to Sweden, just as a huge number have come to other countries. And in a sense, they have been driven out of their countries by the global economic system, as well as conflicts that are linked to that. And they come in and they don't have a today. They don't have a present. They don't have a now. And this group keeps their heads down as far as they can and try and get on with doing jobs, being humiliated with lack of dignity. But every now and then, as happened in Stockholm, with the fires and the arson and so on, and other places in Sweden, the days of rage when the pressures get too much. Now, these people are looking for a home somewhere. They don't have it. And they feel that they are not citizens anywhere. They are denizens without citizenship rights in the full sense. And then we've got the third part of the precariat, which are the young educated who go to university and college. The people I've spoken to in Malmö and Stockholm and other parts of Sweden and in other countries who feel they've been misled and they don't have a future. They come out of university with debts, with long-standing expectations of living in, without a sense of career or without a sense of belonging, without a future. Now, all three groups are in a tension with each other. And the challenge for progressive politics is to unify those three groups in a way of saying, what we need is a better system so that everybody gets basic security, so that all of our needs are being met. That is the political challenge today. And a basic income is not a panacea. I always emphasize it must be seen as part of a new progressive vision, a new progressive road to take. And that, I think, is where the left has been failing. The old social democrats are still stuck. An old record, gramophone record, with the ruts. They just keep going round and round, trying to bring back yesterday, but yesterday is gone. And basically, we need an ecological drive for emancipation, the Enlightenment values for the 21st century, where the values of work, care work, community work, voluntary work, ecological work, are put above jobs, above rent seeking, to the point of where we have a vision of a good society where everybody wants to work on their enthusiasms and develop themselves and care for one another. this is the vision that we should be encouraging. And that's why I hope you put your podcast out, and I hope there will be just a few people who will listen and say, I can do better than that. I can do better than that. I'm going to. That is the message I want to end on.
That is a great message to end on. And I just want to say, don't lose hope, because we are a lot of people, and we've just begun to understand the complexity of this, and there are many more that are coming into it. And Bien in Sweden is growing, and we're trying to educate and make people feel like they can participate. And this is a beginning of something really incredible. I really thank you for joining us today, Guy. Really,
thank you.
Really thank
it's been a pleasure, Najma. It's been a pleasure.
Have a nice day now. Have a nice week.
Same to you. Same to you. Cheers.
Cheers.